Sometimes you have to cut back your plants to get more production. I know it sounds kind of backwards, but it works. Join me today as I discuss topping your tomatoes. How, why, and when. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and behind me are some of my tomato plants. I have 8 plants growing in this trellis. I still have about 6 weeks before my potential first frost date in fall, which should be enough time for these plants to grow and give me a lot of tomatoes. But 6 weeks before my first frost date is about the time I start thinking about topping these plants. When I talk about topping the tomato plants, what I'm talking about is removing the growing tips of these plants. And here's what I mean by that. On an indeterminate tomato plant, the growth is pretty consistent. At each of the nodes or junctions with the main stem, you'll see a leafing branch. You'll see the main stem, and then often you'll have a sucker that extends from the main stem. At the tip of the plant, this process continues. You have the main stem that's going off in this direction right here. You have this leaf branch, and you have a sucker that's developing. Now you often hear that you're supposed to pinch off the sucker because it can grow, rob energy from the plant, and actually make the plant unruly. And there's a lot of truth to that. But the growing tip will keep growing and growing and growing until the plant dies. If you pinch off this growing tip, there's nowhere else for this branch to go. So I have topped this branch. I've pruned off the sucker, I've pruned off the growing tip, and now these leaves will develop. I might get some fruit set along the stem, but this one won't grow any longer. The idea behind this basic pruning method is that we are controlling the growth of the plant. We control how tall it gets and how wide it gets by limiting the future growth of each and every one of these vines. The reason this is called topping a tomato plant is because most often we do this at the top of the plant to limit its vertical growth. Now, I'm 6 feet tall, and as I put my hand up, that's about the height of this branch right here. And so I could allow this branch to continue growing, and it'll grow and maybe flop over, but it makes it more difficult for me to harvest and deal with the plants that grow this tall. So by doing that basic pruning method of just coming in here and pinching off the growing tip, I've now limited how high this plant is going to get. And I can move to the next one down and pinch off the growing tip. So I'm stopping the vertical growth of this plant at this height, which is a manageable height for me. By just coming in and pinching off any suckers I see and the growing tips, I know exactly how tall this plant is going to grow. I mentioned that it's about 6 weeks before my first frost date, and this process is best done 6 to 4 weeks before your anticipated first frost in fall. And to understand why, it helps to understand how these tomato plants are growing. When the weather is great and nice and warm and these plants are getting all the water that they want, the plant wants to continue growing, sending out new leafy growth. So each of these tips will grow, develop a sucker, those suckers will grow, and the plant is putting a lot of energy into just getting bigger. But when we threaten the plant, when we put stress on the plant by pinching off those suckers and those growing tips, now we're signaling to the plant that something is happening. The plant itself is threatened. And now the plant will redirect that energy that would have gone into new leafy growth into the fruit. because that's what all these plants are doing. They want to propagate. So they'll grow fruit to produce seed to propagate. When everything is good, there's not as big a focus for the plant on the fruit. But when that threat comes, well, now it's time to propagate. Now it's time to finish producing the fruit and the seeds, and that's where the energy of the plant will go. Many of us, especially those of us that are in shorter growing seasons, often reach that first frost date with a whole bunch of green tomatoes on the plant. But by topping the plant 4 to 6 weeks before that date, well, we can be harvesting ripe tomatoes well before we get that first frost. And while we call this topping the plant, as I demonstrated, because we pinch off the tips at the top, you can do the same thing with the side of the plant to help keep it under control and also redirect some of that energy into the fruit. So I'll just come in with these branches poking out on the side and do the same thing. Pinching off the growing tip, pinching off any suckers I see, and now all these little flowers will start getting more energy directed right to them, and I should be able to harvest these a little bit sooner than if I had just let this plant continue growing. If you do this during the growing season and stay on top of the plants, you can keep the plant under control. And like you saw on the other side, it's a simple matter of just pinching off the tips. But I've let this side go to show what you might need to do to take more drastic action if your tomato plant starts encroaching into other beds and blocks your pathway. And so these branches are actually extending quite a ways beyond the plant. They're getting too big to actually pinch off. So what I'm going to do is look at this cluster right here of fruit that's starting to develop, and I'm going to cut this back just above the leaf branch. So this leaf branch will still be conducting photosynthesis and help directing energy to the plant, but now it's not going to grow any longer. I can do the same thing with this one right behind it. Now, it has some other flowers developing, but sometimes you have to be a little cruel and cut it back quite a bit to the point that you might be losing out on some of the fruit. But now I've cleared this pathway, and I would have been brushing up against this plant anyway and probably lost that fruit, but by cutting it under my control, I can not only access the other beds, but now know that I can expect some fruit from the tip of these vines. I'll do the same thing with these tomato plants as well. In my other video where I showed how I trellis these tomatoes horizontally to encourage that long growth of the vines, well, at some point I do have to come in and top off or pinch the tips of the lateral growth. I don't want them to keep growing right up to the last frost date and harvest a bunch of green tomatoes. So I may get some of these that will be 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, maybe even longer. But at some point, I do need to make that tough decision to top off these plants. Not as they grow vertically, but as they grow horizontally. The primary focus of topping a tomato plant is for end of season growth, but you can do this at any time during the season to direct the growth, control the growth, and limit how big the plant gets. For these vines that I top, once the tomatoes on that vine have formed and been harvested, there's really little reason to keep that vine. So I can go ahead and take out my pruning shears and cut the vine all the way back and allow the other vines on the plant and the other branches to continue growing until that frost sets in and kills this plant. By topping, by using selective pruning, you should see a dramatic increase in the amount of ripe fruit you get before the cold comes and kills your beloved tomato plants. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.